Hi, I'm Davin Reckow with Hagerty, and I'm the dirty hands behind these videos. This is my cohort Ben with the clean hands behind the camera. Today, we're going to go through our Volkswagen rebuild video, and we're also very glad to see that you liked it so far. But here's some of the inside track on it.
All right, we're happy that you guys got a kick out of our little joke. Yes, we do know that the engine is in the back.
But how do you not start it off with that, right?
Exactly.
And yes, to address some of the questions and concerns about this Beetle, it is a kludge of parts, that's for sure. Relative to the year that it is, and different taillights and bumpers and etc. That doesn't take away the fun of driving this Beetle and the enjoyment that we both actually share.
We did run the VIN finally, which I don't know why we didn't do it before, but it is a 73, so thanks to all the commenters for pointing that out. So what are we looking at here?
So here's the underneath, getting the engine out. I found that a tranny jack worked phenomenal for doing this because of the square pan at the bottom, and you can see it has decades of leaks that have accumulated on both the transaxle and the bottom of the engine, but preserving it from rusting, so that's good, with the exception of surface rust on the suspension.
We had lots of people commenting that we were cheating by doing it this way, that we should have had it up on blocks and dragging it out with a dolly, but you know.
Yeah, I've bench pressed plenty of transmissions, and I tell you what, if you have access to the tools, I don't find that cheating. But hey, to each their own.
Yeah, all right, so we'll get this guy out of here, and on we go to the rebuild. The general sort of thing with these engines is everybody says, like, oh, it's easy to drop them out, they're easy to rebuild, they're so simple, air cooled, that sort of thing. You know there's 4 bolts to undo to?
Yeah, there's 4 bolts to hold it in a splash pan is all that's really there. I think we had roughly an hour and a half in doing it, and that's moving around for filming. So can you have it out in 15 or a half hour? Absolutely. If you've done it before, this is the first time I've ever done it. So at an hour and a half, I'm fine with it.
So what are you taking off here first?
So first thing I was getting out, I left the exhaust on it. Actually, taking it out in the car would have been a pain in my mind. So I left the exhaust on it, so I'm just taking. So the heat exchanger is the big piece that goes up underneath the valve cover right there with a little loop. That is how you get heat to the front of the car. It basically runs a exhaust fan or a blower fan that blows through the tubes and then up into the rocker panels of the car.
Off go the heat exchangers, and this thing had all sorts of like shrouding and
yeah. Everything is. In fact, it's interesting because of as you're pulling it apart, you're thinking, wow, this thing's air cooled. Well, hell, air can't even get to the cylinders because of all the shrouding, but the shrouding is there for the routing off of that fan, blower going around. That washer, look at that washer's right there, Ben. Not sure why we couldn't find it when we put it back together, but hey.
Davin had to manufacture this little cone washer to put our pulley back on because it got lost in the...
It got eaten somewhere in the shop.
Lost in the mix somewhere. So Davin, you were taking the carburetor off here, but there was a funny issue that the carburetor had in regards to the throttle linkage.
Yeah, the way everything was set up, it was only getting quarter throttle.
So anyway, we shot a little clip while we were taking this apart to show you. So here that is.
So basically, I think we can double the horsepower by simply allowing the carburetor to open all the way. So it's going about here on the pedal, but that's wide open. But you can see that the angle that this is all at won't allow it to go to wide open throttle. It almost, well, first off, this is on the wrong side. It should be over here, I'm going to say, based on where it comes out through the fan side of things. Put the spring on this side, but it almost needs a extension on here to where it's out this way, so it's a straight pull. And that would allow it to go to wide open throttle. Right now it won't.
All right, so carburetor comes off, bunch more bits.
Coils out. Just kind of stripping things down to get to the brass tacks of the engine.
So this was interesting, and just in terms of how it was all kind of woven together, which thing to take off first?
Yeah, yeah, there definitely is a sequence to put things back together, because so you have to pull the one side intake runner to get the main intake out, but of course you almost have to pull the generator up as well. Yeah, it's wound together, and of course that intake system would not be. It's functional, but it's not all that efficient. I wouldn't believe.
Which is why a lot of the people who hop up these things do the dual Webers.
The dual Webers, yep. So now we're pulling off that upper shrouding on top of the cylinder head, pulling the pulley off, the main crank pulley.
And as you went here, I mean, like you said earlier, this was your first time, so we kind of in this disassembly, it's like, well, we're working over here.
Yeah.
That's not going to come off. We got to do this one first.
Exactly right. Yep. Yeah, there was a couple spots where there was you had to remove a bolt to get to one shroud, but then you couldn't get to the second one.
And then speaking of bolts, out comes the torch.
Yes. Yeah. So with anything, there's always going to be a bolt here or there that you got to heat up. This one happened to be in the head. We heated that up, and we're able to work them loose. Of course, they're a slot head screw to begin with, so that doesn't make it any more fun. At least it wasn't a Phillips, so that was a benefit. All right, so there's the valve cover. It's got like a little piece of baling wire that holds it down. And here's your shaft rocker assembly, which is wasn't really expected. I was expecting individual rockers, but the shaft rockers definitely appreciate higher RPM better than the individual. Then your push rods, and you can see in this shot that the valve covers were leaking a little bit. That's why you got that grime on top of the intake, or right at the intake. So here's the long and short studs.
What was your first order? I mean, we're coming off doing the Harley, which we pulled the cover off, and there was a mangled piston, so at least we didn't have that.
Yeah, we're happy to see that we didn't have that. There's no holes in the top of the pistons. A lot of crud on top for a running motor, decently running motor. You can see I threw out dial calipers just to see where the bore was at. Because I personally was impressed at how big the bore was. The bore size on this was 94 millimeters. So
which isn't stock for this. These are bigger than.
It is not stock. Yeah. Yep. It's got oversized jugs in it. Yeah. So instead of being a 1600 cc, it's closer to a little over 19.
Gotcha. And this one there, I remember sitting here with this, and we couldn't figure out why each individual jug wouldn't come off, and there ended up being a washer jammed in between those ridges. So
in the slot. Yeah, so in the cooling vents, or the cooling ribs.
So you had to pull them off at the same time. It was very confusing, and then we looked in there like, oh yeah, there's this little washer jammed in there. All right, so the other side, pretty much exactly the same. Except
one jug at a time, no washer holding them together.
So at this point, you're thinking it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, should be.
I found this interesting. This was the kitchen strainer.
Yeah, the kitchen strainer for a filter. Yeah, which there is an aftermarket function you can get to put add a filter, remote filter to it.
Okay, now what are you undoing?
This was the oil pump. Yes, that's right, because it had the metal cover and the oil pump, and then the aluminum piece that's kind of jammed in there to some extent. There's a special tool to utilize.
You tried. Mean it's not a hammer and a screwdriver?
Yeah, probably not the best place to start. But we were gentle. We didn't. There's a difference between gently prying and getting nuts.
So you got it off.
Yeah, we got it out of there. Pretty straightforward from that side. I mean, and the reason they had to do that is because putting it down on that end, you have that parting line of the engine case, so you'd no way ever be able to seal that to create a good pump. So that's why that separate piece is there.
What are we doing here?
Just pushing things down to get the pistons out. So they're the pistons are on they're a floating pin, so they're not pressed into the rod, and it's just a matter of taking a C-clip out of there and then knocking the wrist pin out.
Okay, so now we're splitting the case, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so these are two case halves that come together, so you got a modified engine stand here, enough to hold one side of the case and not both. And the reason we're prying this apart too is there's some locator dowels that you're trying to lift off of. They're not press fit, but they're definitely snug. And then of course the sealant. This just has some general block sealant between them.
And I remember we were kind of going around being like, did we miss a bolt? Because it was a bit of a struggle to get it separated.
Yeah.
Because there is no gasket, but you would put some type of
just some sealer
on there. Now, what are we looking at here?
Here's all the guts. So you got your on the bottom side of the screen here with a big gear in it. That's your camshaft. It's two pieces, but it's not bolted together. It's, the factory ones are riveted, the big gear to the cam, and then your crank on the other half. You can see the lifters are underneath the camshaft here. And when we lifted the one half off, of course, lifters fell out. So I remember we were talking, we're like, oh, well, I wonder how we're going to hold those in when we do it. But there is only one way to do it, and you have to have them in there.
So out come the lifters.
Yeah. And there's your crankshaft assembly.
What were you digging out of there?
That is the distributor.
Okay. Distributor
gear shaft. So you got your main distributor piece, and then you got like a short drive shaft for it.
All right.
And then pulling the bearings out of the case half.
Okay, so we're off the engine stand, but still a little more disassembly to go.
Yeah, based on what we wanted to do. Well, I had planned on pulling and replacing the studs, so started taking those out. Used the torch once again to heat it up. I'm pretty confident this is a magnesium case, which in some worlds magnesium heating up could be a problem, but it's only the powder that burns, not the chunks, the big chunks. So I wasn't real worried about an uncontrollable fire in my shop. But so we were heating things up, making it stinky, and double nutting to get them out.
And this is when we had our first inkling of
Yeah, there was, I don't know how many. I mean, they have an insert anyway, but you can see here where the insert is coming out.
Right
yeah. So you got the insert it's into the aluminum block. You gotta have something steel to hold on to for the head bolts. But eventually there's one that was just JB welded in. So it didn't unscrew, it just pulled out. I was like, oh boy, it might be the very last one.
Yeah, you were scraping at it, you heated it. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, there it is.
So you can see it. It's there's no coil on it at all.
Chunk of JB weld.
At that point, we're like, ooh.
Yeah. And this had a lot of different issues as far as the spacers and how the helicoils that were in it. The jug wasn't actually sealed to the block. There was a gap. I mean, it had miraculously ran. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I felt like one of those things where the sludge that was on it was the only reason it was still running. Yeah.
So here I'm taking the rods off the crankshaft. Different than normal V8s that we have been working on, where the crankshaft will be set into the block, mains caps torqued down, and then you put the rods in. These are the opposite, if you will. It's a lot like a snowmobile from that standpoint.
We have the whole assembly in there.
Yeah, I have the whole assembly and put it in. And then you have, going from main bearings that are diameters that slip on, that pulling off right there. And then you have the brass deal is your gear for the distributor, and then your timing gear, and then another bearing, which you have. Those are all pressed on to some extent, and then that bearing will just slip off. Likewise on the bearings on the other end. So different than other engines that I've worked on, where normally here in the center where you got a half shell, so you have two halves of a bearing. Normally you'd put one in the block and one in the cap, and then you tighten everything down. This you had diameter bearings, complete diameters that would slip on the ends, and then only the bearing in the center. Which going through this found, and it makes complete sense based on the two halves. So you would take the case, put it assembled together, go in and mic everything out, which we did on this case. And determine what the OD of the bearing is, and then based on the crank, then you find out what the ID of that bearing needs to be. Typical circumstance is the OD is the OD. That normally doesn't change, but the ID changes relative to the crank being turned. This has actually 2 areas of adjustment to make parts work. And then there's also, and you can just see it in the bearing over here by the timing gear. There's a hole, and there's oil holes, and then there's a locator hole, or basically an anti-rotation hole. That there's a subsequent pin in the block that keeps them from spinning relative to the block. And then on the far left, there are the shims that you use between the flywheel and the crank. So you set your in play of the crankshaft right to left, down the block.
So define end play. What's the problem with not setting that? And...
Well, if you have too much in play, basically you wipe out your thrust bearing on the rear main right here. So there's no flange. Typically there'd be a flange on the crankshaft that would hold it moving right to left or down the block, if you will. These shims basically do that. And that gap was tight. It's like just roughly, it's like 2 or 3 thou, if I remember right. It was really tight. And you use a dial indicator on it. That's later on in the assembly, but this kind of gives you a nice breakout of where it's at. Here's our progressive Weber. Basically, you give it a freshen while we're here, clean it up, make it look a little nicer as well, and replace any nasty bits in it.
Now, we opened this up, and it was
full of crap.
The bowls were just
yes,
filthy, rusty. I mean, chunks of stuff.
Chunks of stuff. I can't believe that. It's one of those that you open it up and you're like, how did this run smooth at all?
Well, we drove it 2,500 miles,
Yeah.
and it went 75 miles an hour.
Oh, yeah. At a quarter throttle. So.
And then off to Thurlby we go.
Yep. So at Thurlby, we polished the crank. Basically taking any ridges out of it, but you change the diameter slightly, but still within the zone, if you will, of not being turned, if that makes any sense.
Gotcha.
Just a pure polish.
All right, so we left it up to Mark to disassemble the heads for us.
Yep. Yeah, we kind of threw that on his plate. And from what we can tell as well, based on the valve sizes, that these heads are actually off of Porsche. So
if that's true, it would have come off of like a 912 or a 356 or whatever flat four.
Yeah, whatever flat four would be. Here he's heating up the guides to get them out, which you heat up the aluminum a little bit and it swells enough and they tap out pretty easy then.
And this ended up being, we were originally thinking he was just going to do some cleanup on it, but it ended up being.
Yep. Yeah, the seats were shot.
And the guides were, I think, one of the main issues.
Guides were really bad, yeah.
So we
and when the guides are bad, it causes that valve to do this inside the guide, so it slams the seat. It doesn't hit centered every time.
All right. And we made them put them back together for us.
Yes. One of the reasons I didn't pull those apart is my valve spring compressor wouldn't reach without heavy modification.
Now he's pressing out.
Yep. So we replaced the bushings on the little end. So that's what he's doing here is he's pushing the bushings out. Put fresh ones in.
Oh, yep, they're good fresh ones.
Yeah.
Whoop. And then what's he doing here?
So here he's cleaning up the big end of the rods, honing or resizing them.
Making sure they're circular.
Yep. Taking any oval out of them.
And sizing them to what they need to be with whatever.
Yep, and making sure they're to spec as well, not having been oversized. He'll do the same thing with the small end as well, which is what he's doing here.
Yep.
So that brand new bushing, by the nature, it's always a little bit, call it undersized or a little small. So he's setting it to the size, and then of course when you push things in and out, you can disturb the edges of them just a little bit, and that takes any of that out of it.
So you got a rebuild kit, essentially, to put all new bits in here.
Yep. A complete rebuild kit, all the gaskets, the jets and that type of stuff are reused, but they're cleaned out real well. You can see I have a brass. The key here is there's a brass brush and you want to use brass because it takes off the gunk but not remove any material. If you
You're
want
not
to add any scratches, you don't have to. And you can still see in the bottom of that bowl, there's still a little gunk left, and that does get cleaned out before we reassemble it.
It was just filled with crap.
Yeah, that stuff is more staining as it is, and it is actual chunks floating around. But, so fresh gaskets, all the screws go back in, evenly tighten them around. You can see I put a little actually wheel bearing grease on the threads. You're going into aluminum. Steel into aluminum just makes sense. You could use anything from a lubricant. I've used wheel bearing grease, obviously, Vaseline, anti-seize, anything just to put something there, and clean up, and there it is.
Now the fun stuff.
Yeah, so here's the crankshaft that we mentioned before. It has to go in the block halves as an assembly, so you have to assemble everything here.
Now you put it on the flywheel.
I put it on the flywheel simply to stand it up. You could do it laying on the table. Actually, I found this was very handy instead of it rolling around.
Wait, was this the one?
So, yeah, there's something to note here. You'll notice that I had a little, I'll call it flung the rod after I put it on. The reason I did that is the first time we put the rod bearings on, it didn't fling.
It just clamped onto the...
Yeah, we had the crank was standard size, and we had 10 under bearings. So there was a massive interference, well, right about 7 thousandths. And yes, for those of you watching, no, initially I did not check. I would have caught that if I would have put one bearing in and mic'd out the crank. The second time, I mic'd the crank and mic'd the bearings. I think that's the first time I haven't done that.
I think that was just sort of a like, we assumed that the right part got ordered.
Yeah, we did.
And they didn't. So we got the right pieces.
Right.
And
which, it's a cardinal sin because you always mic them regardless of the right one, blah, blah, blah.
Because they might send you the wrong one.
They
might
right
accidentally
send
exactly. One of the wrong ones and 3 of the right ones.
And then when we talk, in our description that, just because everyone says, oh, these are the easiest things ever. They're the easiest thing ever when it goes right. When it goes wrong, they're just as crappy as anything else.
Same thing could be said for a Chevy small block.
Absolutely, right.
Or really any engine, but like
really
the ones that have the ones that have the common sort of, oh, they're so easy.
Yeah.
They're easy until they aren't.
Right. And everybody on the couches aren't doing them. They're not that easy. They're not a bag of chips. So this is after we went through your crankcase is no good. We're like, oh no.
Yes. So speaking of crankcase.
There it is.
Here's our fancy new one.
This is a brand new empty crankcase. Aluminum, built way heavier than the stock one. Which bit us in a couple spots, but only from a clearance standpoint. And but it's a lot beefier case. It comes line honed. It's all ready to assemble. I did have to clean it. I wrenched things out and got some bits out of it from shipping and that. It's got beautiful steel inserts in there that are not JB welded into the case. So a couple of cool things like that.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the spots you can see right where the hold down clamp, looks like I've already hit that. See the hold down clamp there on the
point to it?
Right here. That was one area I had to clearance with die grinder because the case was beefier right there. There was plenty of meat to work with. Just the clamp I had to clearance it so it sat down flush. Otherwise, it was kicking up.
Okay. And we did, as we come into this new case here, the reason we did get the new case wasn't just because of those, of the JB Weld things that we pulled out of there. It was, we took it to the shop to have it checked to see if we could reuse it, and they basically told us no. We shot a quick clip of Davin explaining that, so here it is.
So after we carefully taken apart the engine block and separated everything out, got our stuff apart, we started doing the inspections. A couple of critical areas in here are the journal for your crankshaft and the journal for your camshaft. These can be honed, align honed after they're assembled, both journals, and then bearings purchased accordingly. Of course, bearings are only offered in certain sizes, and what we found on our inspection was these journals have already been taken to their max. Plus, you'll see that there's been some damage to the journals. Specifically, the pin that holds the bearing from rotating in this one has completely been wiped out. And if you remember, we had to use a torch in a couple areas to get studs out. And we had some pretty ugly inserts that have already been put in here and been replaced, and pretty nasty. So what do you do when you have too many problems with a block? In this case, you do this right here. A brand new one. All beautiful, shiny, perfectly machined, and ready to be assembled. Yeah, that case was ugly.
Yeah, it was.
It's seen all of its life. So here we're putting in the head studs. You see I'm wiping off the excess, but using some sealer, aviation sealer, to hold those in. High tack is another version of that. The idea is it seals them for oil leakage and locks them in place.
So now you're getting ready to drop the crank in.
Yep.
And the camshaft.
Yep, rods are on. You see now the camshaft, that's brand new camshaft. Again, that I opted for, there was nothing wrong with the stock camshaft that was in it, other than it didn't complement the bore. So the bigger bore size, you might as well take advantage of a little more lift on the camshaft in different durations, so it'll fuel it better. It has an aluminum bolt-on timing gear. You can see brand new lifters. There are the brand new main bearings and camshaft bearings. Just using a little assembly lube, so it's on there. When the crankshaft goes, everything goes back together. Put the timing gear back in. I'm sorry, the timing gear and the distributor gear. So there goes the lifters into that half, which is easy because they're on the downside, so they're going to stay where they need to be at. Set the crankshaft in, obviously making sure the rods go through the hole in the bottom. Making sure here, I'm making sure that those dowel pins are lined up for the main bearing so they don't spin. Putting in the last or the center bearing, which actually I got it lubed up, but you can see it's not there. That half goes into the other case half. Loctiting in the bolts for the camshaft, torquing them down. Again, lubing up the cam lobes for assembly or for initial fire up. Here's the lifters in the other half. Now, I mentioned earlier that we were concerned how we were going to hold them in there. Actually, what happened was really nice is they typically don't ride all the way in. They ride, say, I don't know, 100 thousandths up. But when you push them in just that 100 thousandths more, there's just enough bite, just enough resistance in the case and that they hold them. So when you flip them upside down, they pop. They stay there, and then you can just push them down.
Nice.
Into place. Yes.
Okay, so on goes.
So here's the case half sealant. So wiped everything down. Everything's clean. There's no burrs, all that type of stuff. And just putting a real thin layer on all the surfaces that come together. And again, there's some alignment pins and everything, and you can see them you can see that case half sinking together. So in goes the oil filter strainer.
In the background there, you're getting the pistons ready.
Yep. We ordered pistons and didn't think anything about the price because it was reasonable for 4 pistons. And when we got the pistons had the rings on them already. Of course, it came with wrist pins, but it also came with new jugs. And it was like, wow, that was dirt cheap for, pistons and jugs. It was under $400, and I was like, wow, that's crazy.
So we didn't need to replace the jugs.
The jugs didn't need to be replaced, but at that point we got free machining by buying brand new jugs, so it just made sense to use them. So here the only trick, if you will, and you can see it in the background. So we put the piston into the jug with the ring compressor first, then slip it down over, push the wrist pin through into the so through the piston into the rod, and then of course across the other side. One clip is already in the piston, and then here I'm just putting the last clip in that holds that wrist pin from coming out.
So there goes the pin. Now the pin's in.
Yep, and there's the clip. Yep.
But what you were doing in the background there was you were adding a little bead of.
Well,
something.
that's a little separate. Yeah. So just before I put the pistons into the jug, speaking with a Volkswagen aficionado, he recommended to take instead of using any of the shims and all that, because I didn't need to. I had already set my head height on that top end where my hand's at. We had machined those, but at any rate, to get the right compression height. So then when I set that in there, I put a bead of high temperature silicone, the orange Ultra Seal.
Around here, right?
Yep, right at that groove, or the corner, if you will, the cylinder jug to the fins.
So right where it meets here.
Right where it meets there, yep. And that is to seal that up right there. Because you're really only sealing some crank pressure, but for the most part, it's not a normal head gasket or thought process of a head gasket. It is just sealing the oil. So by doing that puts enough sealant there without getting ugly. Now you might be able to see it when it pushes in. I said I put it just in the corner. I remember a couple spots where you could see it. There you go. So you can just see the orange.
There you go.
That pushed out. Yep.
All right. Now what are these going on
These
here?
are very fancy push rod tubes.
I thought it was cool in the time lapse here as you tightened it down, you can see those little areas compress.
Yeah. Yep.
There it goes. Boop.
Yep. Now this is the first set of cylinders we put on ever. Right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the first time I've ever done this. Okay. For those that know, will see that I did not put in that shroud. There is absolutely no way to put the shroud in after you put the head on in the tubes.
And a couple commenters caught that.
And a couple commenters caught it, and they were 100% right. On the second set, I caught it when we went to do the second set of cylinders. I put it on the second set, and I had to come back and pull the head off, basically redo this sequence. I didn't obviously pull the cylinders up, and then slid that in there. So in the car, it is there. Something else I want to note too, that we powder coated the valve covers. Pretty much anything that's matte black has been powder coated. Reason for that is it holds up way better than paint. Now, I don't believe this engine's going to get over 400 degrees and have any issues with the plastic of the powder coating. So if it does, we'll probably get different problems.
Yeah, if the valve covers are getting up to 400 degrees, then, then we definitely have some issues.
Yeah. So same thing on the other side.
You can see that red goop again.
Yep. Yep. You can see it.
Ah, there it is.
Look at that. There's the shield. That's on the other side. And yes, I shouldn't say it's a shield. It is part of the cooling system.
To drive it, when it comes down, to drive air across
the
bottom side of that.
Yep. So there's a rocker assembly on there. You can see I set the valve lash right in there. There's the fueler gauge setting the valve lash. We didn't necessarily show. You can see I got a wrench on there rotating the crankshaft to set everything correctly.
All the little bits that you'd only catch in a frame.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I would say a lot of the comments that we get on these in terms of how we did it is usually in regards to stuff that we did, but because of the nature of these videos,
exactly,
you're just not going to see, or they're just mundane enough that where it's like, well, there's no point in shooting it. Okay, so.
Yes.
Dun, dun, dun.
Gotta have the book out. So, yeah. Only because the first time I had, it has a half lobe type of function or an off center mark, and it was just a question for me of where where does everything need to line up? Depending on the year that we don't know, depending on this, that, and the other thing, there's about 4 different positions of where it could be at. And at the end of the day, I need to make a judgment call of what it needed to be. So here we're getting that in there. And what the flashlight's doing in there is I'm looking and making sure I'm getting everything lined up, because there's a shaft, a spring, and then the distributor has to line up to everything as you go in there. And then you have the nice the hold down clamp for the distributor. Oil pump goes back in.
What kind of goop are you using?
A little bit of that. Again, that aviation sealer, gasket maker type of stuff. And then gears go back in and filled it with lithium grease. And the idea there is it picks up faster as far as the pump is concerned.
Meaning the pump turns into a pump faster.
Yes.
It's got more suction to get the oil moving.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
We opted to reuse the kind of ugly, I know, oil cooler. The adapter and everything's cleaned up, and I flushed out the oil cooler really well and was happy with that.
I think we had a comment at somebody sent us an email that said that their company remakes or refurbishes oil
which
coolers.
I have now on the list, so that'll happen next time.
Nice.
Fuel pump went in here to the right, and then the stand for the generator is what's on the right hand side, or the farthest right.
And also the oil fill tube, right?
Yes, and the oil fill is part of all that assembly there. There you can see it really well.
Yeah, that oil cooler is kind of heinous, huh?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
but it works.
That's right. It goes away here in a little bit. Brand new. End up with pretty much all brand new shrouding, just because the other one had some tabs that were beat off, broke up, and it wasn't worth repairing them for $30. And these are all again. I had they were brand new. I bead-blasted them and had them powder coated, so they'll hold up a little better. The paint that was on them was pretty thin. Crank pulley back on. I mean, it's starting to look good again here, if you will.
So now you can see we have both of those.
Yes, there we go. Proof right there. So there's one there and one there. So we redeemed ourselves there before it went in the car. These are what we were just talking about. There's this bottom heat duct shrouding for the cooling end of it. They were flat pretty much in a bend to put in position. So they weren't ridiculous, but it took a little effort to get there.
Okay, so now we're nearing the end here.
Yeah, nearing the end. So now I'm putting the big heat exchanger back on. That actually has a high temperature paint put on them that's gold when you spray it on, and then you bake it to 550 degrees, and it turns that gray, and that is the best coating I've ever found for exhaust. So here we're putting the fan all back together again. Everything was stripped and shot.
Now this was a fun process.
This was a fun process because it was not happy.
No.
For whatever reason, that shroud the fan itself wanted to rub on the shroud, and there was a lot of shimming and cussing. So here again, here's if you look right there by the distributor in my hand, there is a rod end and that little linkage piece. That's the key to getting
this guy.
Yeah.
Which the old intake manifold did not have.
Yeah, the old intake manifold did not have that. So what was happening is as the cable come out of the fan shroud, it was coming up at a 45-degree angle to the carburetor and pulling down, but it has to go past the 6 o'clock position to go to full throttle. So this rectified that, and you'll see it here again when we get the should say when we get the carburetor on. But that little welded on, or not weld, cast in bung was the key to all this. So we reused the fuel pump. It was fine. Obviously the distributor. So those two pieces show a little wear there, and the generator was good. Freshly rebuilt carburetor on there. A long search for the nut or the washer to go here, but fabricated up a nice one. It looks good.
It looks good. He painted it.
Yep. So last step now is to get the exhaust on. And I don't remember what that brand was. Somebody asked, and I'll have to get it. I got it through Apple Tree in Michigan here.
All right. So what are you hooking back up?
So here's running the the ignition wires over to the correct area and figuring out how we wanted to lay the fuel line based on, for all intents and purposes, the Weber was not designed to go on this engine with, it's on backwards, if you will, because your choke adjustment and your fuel intake is on the backside against that shroud, and it is a pain in the monkey to do it, especially to adjust it. This is where it's handy that it's light.
Yeah, and handy that there's a video guy.
Although I want you to look at the look on that video guy's face, going, "Holy cow! This is the heaviest camera I've ever lifted."
Yep.
Now here, this is where I'm talking about when you set me in play. So there's the gauge. I got the flex flywheel on. Got it torqued down. Now I don't have it torqued down to the crazy number that it needs to be yet. It's just taking up the slack.
Oh, is that me trying to murder you there?
It looks like Ben's trying to take me out.
I was bringing you a hammer.
You were bringing me the hammer, yep, because I used a aluminum plate to put the rear main seal in after I checked and knew what kind of shims I needed in there to get that in-play correct. Now I had to make I didn't happen to have the right clutch tool, alignment tool, so I had to turn one on the lathe. I didn't worry about any splines.
That's
because
why
I used to use the diameter. Diameter is the same thing.
That's why you're special.
Yeah.
Because if we don't have a part, you just make it.
Just make it. That's right. All right. There's that and that's stainless exhaust. That is all stainless. It functions fully like the original stuff does, but I'll tell you what, the flow is a lot nicer and it sounds good.
I love the fact that like this engine's sitting there. You could just start it up sitting there if you wanted to.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
There's no radiator to hook up. There's no
nothing.
It's all right there.
Yep, it's all.
I mean, you basically just need fuel and like hook a battery
and a way
to
to spin it. Yep. Yeah, because the starter bolts to the transmission side of it. And now we're back on the tranny jack. This right here is where 2 more inches would have been fantastic, and it has nothing to do with the other exhaust because it was equally as a bear to get that little piece out right there.
Yeah, what the time-lapse doesn't show is us spending like a half an hour
finagling things to get it lined up.
Around to get it in. Instead, it's like, oh, look, we did this in 5 minutes. So we're pretty much wrapping things up here.
Yep, everything's wrapped up, timing set. We broke the engine in right between that shot.
But, you know, with Hollywood, we gotta make it flow. You guys don't want to sit there for 20 minutes watching us break it.
Yeah, that's not real impressive, I don't think, either.
So off you go.
Yep, off we roll. No, so glad you're still watching. We got more things to come. As you noticed, or may not have noticed in the shop, there's some Where Waldos in there of a couple of the projects and a couple of things up our sleeves as well. Not in that shop.
Yep. A couple maybe out of the ordinary for what you've seen so far for the Redline rebuilds. But leave comments if you have any more questions about this video, or if you have any suggestions for what engines we should be working on. I know we've gotten comments about doing a Chevy Big Block, Ford 289, straight 6, straight 8. Some people ask for a Porsche engine. I mean, isn't that the same thing as what we just did?
Pretty close.
Just 2 more cylinders, right?
Yeah, maybe. So
So
yeah.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
See ya.